I became a widow, and my son took over the company. At a business meeting, my daughter-in-law shouted, "Go clean the bathroom, you wrinkled old woman." When I spoke to the billionaire sheikh in fluent Arabic, she immediately went pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought the boardroom where I'd made my most important decisions would become the stage for my greatest humiliation. At 66, I believed I'd earned respect, that my years building Richardson Industries alongside my late husband would count for something. I was wrong. The mahogany table stretched before me like an accusation. 20 years ago, I sat at its head making decisions that affected hundreds of employees. Today, I occupied a corner chair, barely visible, as my son Lionel fumbled through a presentation to potential investors. My chest tightened, watching him struggle with numbers I could recite in my sleep. "The quarterly projections show?" Lionel's voice wavered as he clicked through slides. His hands shook slightly, and I fought the urge to step in. This was his company now. I'd handed it over after Harold's death 2 years ago, thinking it was time to step back, to let the next generation lead. Juniper, my daughter-in-law, sat beside him in a chair that used to be mine. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently against her tablet as she watched Lionel struggle. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her navy suit looked more expensive than my monthly pension. "Perhaps we should focus on the international expansion potential," suggested Mr. Peterson, one of 3 investors who'd flown in from New York. His gray eyebrows furrowed as he studied the profit margins. Lionel glanced at Juniper, seeking guidance. She leaned forward, her voice smooth and professional. "Absolutely. We're looking at several emerging markets. The profit potential is enormous." I bit my tongue. Those markets weren't emerging anymore, and the profit margins she quoted were outdated by at least 5 years. Harold and I had explored those exact opportunities before his diagnosis, but the political climate had shifted dramatically since then. "What about the regulatory challenges in those regions?" asked Ms. Chen, the second investor. She was younger than the others, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Juniper's confident smile faltered for just a moment. "Well, we're confident that won't be an issue." That wasn't an answer, and everyone in the room knew it. I shifted in my chair, the leather creaking softly. Lionel's face was flushing red, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Mom," he said suddenly, turning to me, "maybe you could explain the regulatory framework we dealt with in the Middle Eastern markets?" All eyes turned to me. For a moment, I felt that familiar surge of purpose, the same feeling I'd had countless times when Harold and I navigated complex international deals. I opened my mouth to speak. "Excuse me." Juniper's voice cut through the room like a blade. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. Her face was twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Embarrassment, anger, or something else entirely. "Janine," she said, her voice rising with each word, "this is a professional meeting. We don't need you here confusing everyone with outdated information." The room fell silent. I felt heat creep up my neck, a flush of embarrassment and shock. "I was just trying to help." "Help?" Juniper's laugh was sharp, cruel. "You want to help? Go clean the bathroom, you wrinkled old woman. Leave the real business to people who actually understand the modern world." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my hands instinctively gripping the arms of my chair. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. Ms. Chen stared at her papers. The third investor, a man in his 50s whose name I'd forgotten, looked like he wanted to disappear. Lionel sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell his wife that she'd just insulted the woman who'd built this company from nothing. He just sat there, looking between Juniper and me with the expression of a child caught between fighting parents. "Juniper," he finally whispered, but his voice carried no authority. No outrage, just embarrassment. "What?" She spun toward him, her eyes blazing. "Your mother needs to understand her place. She's not the CEO anymore. She's not even officially part of this company. She's a retired widow who should be at home knitting or whatever old ladies do. Each word was a nail in my coffin. I felt smaller with every syllable, shrinking into myself until I wondered if I might disappear entirely. This was the woman my son had chosen, the woman he'd brought into our family business, the woman who now spoke for Richardson Industries. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. The room spun slightly, and I had to grip the back of my chair to steady myself. "I think I should go," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's probably best," Juniper said, already turning back to the investors with a bright, professional smile. "Now, where were we?" "Ah, yes, the expansion opportunities." I walked toward the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Each step echoed in my ears, loud as thunder. As I reached for the handle, I heard Mr. Peterson's voice behind me. "Actually, I think we need to reschedule this meeting. We'll be in touch." I didn't turn around to see Juniper's reaction. I couldn't bear to see her face, to see Lionel's continued silence, to witness the collapse of everything Harold and I had built. I simply opened the door and walked out. The hallway felt endless. Past the reception area where Sarah, our longtime secretary, looked up with concern in her eyes. Past the portraits of company milestones that included photos of Harold and me cutting ribbons, shaking hands with international partners, celebrating our first $1 million contract. I made it to my car before the tears came. Sitting in the parking lot of the building that bore my family's name, I sobbed like I hadn't since Harold's funeral. But this was different. When Harold died, I'd lost my partner, my best friend, my anchor. Today, I'd lost something else entirely. I'd lost myself. As I drove home to my empty house, Juniper's words echoed in my mind. "Wrinkled old woman. Go clean the bathroom. Leave the real business to people who understand the modern world." Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just a relic of a bygone era, clinging to relevance in a world that had moved on without me. Maybe it was time to accept that my role now was to be invisible, to fade into the background and let the younger generation take control. But deep in my chest, beneath the humiliation and pain, something else stirred, something I hadn't felt in 2 years. It felt like anger, but sharper. It felt like determination, but colder. It felt like the woman I used to be, waking up from a long sleep. The house felt cavernous when I returned home. Harold and I had bought it 30 years ago when Richardson Industries first turned a real profit, thinking we'd fill it with children and grandchildren, with dinner parties and holiday celebrations. Instead, it had become a museum of memories, each room echoing with conversations that would never happen again. I walked through the foyer, past the antique mirror that reflected a woman I barely recognized. When had my shoulders started curving inward like that? When had my face developed those deep lines of worry? Juniper's words followed me like ghosts. Wrinkled old woman. In the kitchen, I put the kettle on and stared out the window at the garden Harold had lovingly maintained. The roses were overgrown now, wild and untended since his death. I'd let so many things go these past 2 years, including myself. The familiar whistle of the kettle pulled me back to the present. As I poured hot water over my tea bag, my eyes fell on the stack of mail I'd been avoiding on the counter. Bills, mostly, and what looked like legal documents. I'd been letting Lionel handle the financial aspects of my life, trusting him to manage my investments and pension from the company. Maybe that had been a mistake. I carried my tea to Harold's study, a room I'd avoided since his death. The leather chair behind his desk still held the impression of his body, and his reading glasses lay exactly where he'd left them on that last morning when he'd insisted on reviewing quarterly reports, despite the chemo making him nauseous. But today, I needed to remember who we'd been together, who I'd been before grief and guilt convinced me to step aside. I opened the filing cabinet where Harold had kept our most important documents. The first folder made my breath catch. Middle East Ventures, 1995-2010. Inside were contracts written in both English and Arabic, photos of us at groundbreaking ceremonies in Dubai and Qatar, letters of recommendation from ministers and sheiks praising our innovative approaches to sustainable construction in desert climates. There was a photo I'd forgotten about, Harold and me standing beside a completed water treatment facility in Jordan. I was wearing a hard hat and work clothes, my hair shorter then, my face glowing with accomplishment. The facility had provided clean water to 30,000 people. We'd done that. Together. "You look so proud in this one," Harold had said when we'd first seen the developed photo. "Like you could take on the world." "I feel like I could," I'd replied. And meant it. Now I traced my finger over that confident woman's face. What had happened to her? I pulled out more files, more memories. The contract for our first international project, signed when Lionel was just 12. The letter from the Saudi Arabian government, thanking us for completing their hospital complex ahead of schedule and under budget. The newspaper article calling Harold and me the power couple of international construction. That article had hung in our bedroom for years until I'd taken it down after the funeral, unable to bear the reminder of what we'd lost. But as I read through these documents, I realized something that made my chest tight with a different kind of pain. I hadn't just lost Harold. I'd lost myself, and I'd done it voluntarily. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. Lionel's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mom?" His voice was strained, exhausted. "I'm sorry about today. She was stressed about the meeting." I set down the photo I'd been holding. "Stressed enough to humiliate me in front of investors?" "She didn't mean it like that. You know how she gets when she's nervous." No, I didn't know how she got when she was nervous, because Juniper had never shown me anything but cool politeness at best, and barely concealed irritation at worst. But Lionel had been making excuses for her behavior for 3 years now, ever since they'd married. "How did the meeting end?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "They postponed their decision, said they needed to review our management structure." His voice cracked slightly. "Mom, I don't know what I'm doing. The company is hemorrhaging money, and Juniper keeps pushing these expansion plans that I don't understand." My heart ached for him. Lionel had never wanted to run Richardson Industries. He'd studied art history in college, had dreams of working in museums or galleries. But when Harold got sick, someone had to step up, and I'd been too consumed with caring for my dying husband to see that Lionel wasn't ready. "What kind of expansion plans?" I asked. "She wants to sell off the manufacturing division and focus entirely on real estate development. She says manufacturing is dead, that the future is in luxury residential projects." I closed my eyes. The manufacturing division was the heart of our company, the foundation Harold and I had built everything else on. It might not be glamorous, but it was steady, profitable, and employed over 200 people who'd been with us for decades. "Have you looked at the actual numbers?" I asked. "Juniper handles all that. She's got her MBA from Wharton, and she says I should trust her expertise." That MBA from Wharton hadn't included 15 years of hands-on experience in international markets. It hadn't included the knowledge of which suppliers were reliable and which governments kept their promises. It hadn't included the relationships Harold and I had built with partners across 3 continents. "Lionel," I said carefully, "maybe we should sit down and go through the books together. Just the 2 of us." "I don't know, Mom. Juniper says you're too stuck in the past, that you don't understand modern business practices." The dismissal stung, but beneath it, I heard something else in my son's voice. Fear. He was drowning, and the woman he'd married was pushing him deeper underwater instead of throwing him a lifeline. "I learned Arabic so we could negotiate our own contracts in the Middle East," I said quietly. "I studied international law so we wouldn't get cheated by foreign governments. I spent 3 months living in Jordan to understand the local customs and building codes. Does that sound like someone who doesn't understand business?" There was a long silence. "You learned Arabic?" he asked finally. I realized he'd never known that. I'd kept so much of my professional life separate from my role as his mother, thinking I was protecting him from the stress and demands of running a company. Instead, I'd made myself invisible to my own son. "I learned Arabic, Mandarin, and enough Portuguese to get by," I said. "Your father used to joke that I could negotiate a deal anywhere in the world and then teach him what I'd learned over dinner. I never knew that. Of course he didn't. After Harold died, I'd been so focused on grief and on protecting Lionel from the burden of the company that I'd never told him about the woman I'd been before I became just mom, and then the widow. There's a lot you don't know," I said, "about the company, about our international connections, about the way business really works. Juniper says, what does Juniper actually know about Richardson Industries?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "She's been here 3 years, Lionel. Your father and I built this company over 25 years. We made mistakes, learned from them, built relationships that took decades to develop, and now she wants to throw all of that away for some trendy real estate scheme?" I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing what I'd said. "She showed me projections," he said finally. "The profits from luxury developments could be enormous." "Could be," I repeated. "But what about the risks? What about our existing contracts? What about our employees?" "She says we can't make decisions based on sentiment." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sentiment? Is that what she calls loyalty? Responsibility? The foundation that keeps a company stable through economic downturns? The silence stretched between us. I could picture Lionel in his office, probably staring at the same portrait of Harold and me that had hung there for 15 years. The one Juniper had asked him to remove because it was dated. "Mom," he said finally, his voice small, "I think I'm in over my head." That admission broke something open in my chest, not just sympathy for my struggling son, but a recognition of what I'd allowed to happen. I'd stepped aside too completely, too quickly, leaving him vulnerable to someone who saw Richardson Industries not as a legacy to be protected, but as an asset to be exploited. "Then maybe it's time to swim back to shore," I said. After we hung up, I sat in Harold's chair and stared at the files spread across his desk. Photos of groundbreaking ceremonies, contracts worth millions, letters from grateful clients whose projects we'd completed against impossible odds. Juniper was wrong about one thing. I wasn't stuck in the past. I was the past, present, and future of Richardson Industries all rolled into one. And tomorrow, I was going to start proving it. But first, I had some Arabic to practice. The call came at 7 in the morning, jolting me from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. I'd spent the previous evening going through Harold's old business contacts, refreshing my memory of projects and partnerships that Lionel probably didn't even know existed. "Mom?" Lionel's voice was tense, almost frantic. "We have a situation. There's a potential investor coming in today, and Juniper is insisting you stay away from the office." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. What kind of investor? Someone big, really big. From the Middle East. His name is Omar Al-Rashid, and apparently he's interested in acquiring Richardson Industries entirely. Omar Al-Rashid. The name tugged at something in my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. How did he hear about us? That's the strange part. Juniper says he reached out directly, said he'd been following our work for years. But I don't remember any recent projects that would have caught international attention. Of course he didn't. Lionel had been so focused on domestic contracts that he'd let most of our international relationships lapse. But someone had been watching, someone who remembered when Richardson Industries had been a force in global construction. "When is the meeting?" I asked. 2 o'clock. "And Mom?" Juniper was very clear. "She doesn't want any complications." Complications. That's what I'd become in my own company. "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. After Lionel hung up, I stood in my kitchen drinking coffee and staring out at Harold's overgrown roses. Omar Al-Rashid. Why did that name feel familiar? I went back to Harold's study and pulled out our Middle Eastern files again, this time searching more systematically. Contract files, correspondence, project reports. There, in a folder marked Qatar Infrastructure Project 2008, I found it. A letter of introduction from Prince Khalid Al Rashid, recommending his nephew Omar for a summer internship with our company. The young man had been studying engineering at MIT and wanted practical experience with international construction. I remembered him now. 24 years old, serious beyond his years, asking thoughtful questions about everything from soil composition to local labor practices. He'd spent 3 months with us, working alongside Harold and me on a water treatment facility outside Doha. Harold had been impressed with his work ethic and his innovative suggestions for dealing with the extreme desert conditions. "That boy has a good head on his shoulders," Harold had said after Omar returned to MIT for his senior year. "He'll go far." It seemed Harold had been right. At 1:30, I did something I hadn't done in months. I got dressed like I meant business. The navy blue suit still fit, though it hung a bit looser than it had 2 years ago. I found the pearls Harold had given me for our 20th anniversary. The ones I used to wear to important meetings because he said they made me look formidable yet approachable. I wasn't planning to crash the meeting. I was simply going to drive by the office, maybe see this Omar al-Rashid for myself. Curiosity, nothing more. The parking lot was fuller than usual when I arrived. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows sat near the main entrance, and I could see unfamiliar figures in dark suits positioned near the building. Omar al-Rashid traveled with security, serious security. I parked at the far end of the lot and walked toward the building, my heels clicking on the asphalt with a confidence I didn't entirely feel. Sarah looked up as I entered the lobby, her face brightening with surprised pleasure. "Mrs. Richardson, I didn't expect to see you today. I left some files in my old office," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "Is the meeting still going on?" "Oh yes. They're in the main conference room. That Mr. al-Rashid is quite impressive. Very polite, but you can tell he doesn't miss anything." I nodded and headed toward the elevator. But as the doors opened, I changed my mind. Instead, I took the stairs to the second floor, which had a corridor that ran behind the conference room. The walls were thin, and if I remembered correctly, there was a maintenance closet that shared a wall with the meeting space. I felt slightly ridiculous sneaking around my own building like a spy, but Juniper had made it clear I wasn't welcome. If I wanted to know what was happening to my company, this was my only option. The maintenance closet was unlocked, filled with cleaning supplies and extra office furniture. I pressed my ear to the wall and heard voices, muffled but understandable. "Impressive growth potential," Juniper was saying, her voice carrying that bright, professional tone she used when she was trying to impress someone. "We're looking at expanding into luxury residential developments, moving away from the outdated manufacturing focus." Outdated? The voice that responded was deep, cultured, with just a hint of an accent. Omar al-Rashid. Richardson Industries built some of the most innovative water treatment facilities in the Gulf region. That hardly seems outdated. "Well, yes, but that was years ago," Juniper laughed, a sound that made my teeth clench. "We're focused on the future now, not living in the past." "The past often informs the future," Omar said quietly. "Your company's reputation in the Middle East is still quite strong. I was hoping to discuss some of those historical relationships." "I'm afraid most of that institutional knowledge left with my husband's mother." Lionel's voice, apologetic and embarrassed. "She was involved in those projects, but she's retired now." "Retired or sidelined?" Omar asked, and I heard something sharp in his tone. "Retired," Juniper said quickly. "She's in her late 60s, you understand. Not really equipped for modern business practices. Not equipped. In her late 60s, as if that disqualified me from thinking. I gripped the handle of a mop so tightly my knuckles went white. "I see," Omar said, but his tone suggested he didn't see it all, or didn't like what he was seeing. "And the manufacturing division? I understand there's been discussion about selling it." "Absolutely," Juniper's voice perked up. "It's a drain on resources. The real money is in high-end residential development, luxury condos, exclusive communities. That's where the profit margins are." "And the 200 employees currently working in manufacturing?" There was a pause. "Well, obviously there would be some restructuring. 200 people who'd worked for Richardson Industries for decades, some since Harold and I first started the company, reduced to a euphemism." "I'd like to see the actual financial reports," Omar said. "Not just the projections, but the real numbers. Income, expenses, profit margins by division." "Of course," Lionel said. "Juniper handles all of that." "Actually," Omar's voice was carefully neutral, "I'd prefer to review them with someone who has a longer historical perspective. Someone who understands the company's full trajectory, not just the last few years." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Juniper said, her voice cooling noticeably. "As I mentioned, the previous generation is no longer involved in day-to-day operations." "Perhaps she could be consulted? As a courtesy?" "Mr. al-Rashid," Juniper's voice had taken on an edge, "I can assure you that my husband and I are perfectly capable of providing any information you need. We don't need to disturb elderly family members." Elderly family members. As if I were some doddering relative instead of the woman who'd built half the relationships that made this meeting possible. "Of course," Omar said, but I could hear the subtle withdrawal in his voice. Perhaps we should reschedule for another time. I have some other matters to attend to. Wait, Lionel's voice was panicked. Is there anything specific you need to know? Anything we can clarify? I'll be in touch, Omar said politely, but I recognized the tone. Harold had used it hundreds of times when ending meetings with people he had no intention of doing business with. I heard chairs scraping, voices moving toward the door. The meeting was over, and from the sound of it, it had not gone well. I slipped out of the maintenance closet and made my way down the back stairs, reaching the parking lot just as the conference room windows came into view. I could see figures moving around inside, could see Juniper's animated gestures as she talked rapidly to Lionel. Then I saw him. Omar al-Rashid stood near the windows, no longer the eager young intern I remembered, but a man in his full power. He was taller than I'd expected, his dark hair silvered at the temples, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence in his posture, the way he held himself like someone accustomed to command. He was looking out the window, scanning the parking lot, and for just a moment, his gaze seemed to settle on me. I was too far away to see his expression clearly, but something made me think he was thinking, calculating, perhaps remembering. Then one of his security men approached him, said something quietly, and Omar nodded. He turned away from the window and disappeared from view. Minutes later, the black SUVs pulled out of the parking lot in a convoy, taking Omar al-Rashid away from Richardson Industries, possibly forever. I sat in my car watching them disappear down the street, feeling something I couldn't quite name. Opportunity, maybe, or recognition. That young man who'd worked alongside Harold and me in the scorching heat of the Qatar desert had grown into someone with the power to save or destroy everything we'd built. And Juniper had just chased him away with her arrogance and dismissal of the very knowledge he'd come seeking. My phone buzzed with a text from Lionel. Meeting didn't go well. We need to talk. I stared at the message, then at the building that bore my family's name. Tomorrow, I decided, I was going to do something I should have done 2 years ago. I was going to stop being invisible. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Omar al-Rashid standing at that conference room window, saw the polite but final way he'd ended the meeting. By morning, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. I was going to find him. It took 3 phone calls and a favor from an old contact at the Chamber of Commerce, but I discovered Omar was staying at the Fairmont downtown. He was scheduled to fly back to Dubai the following morning, which meant I had less than 24 hours to undo the damage Juniper had done. At 10 a.m., I called the hotel and asked to be connected to his room. Mr. al-Rashid's suite, a professional voice answered, probably an assistant. This is Janine Richardson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. From Richardson Industries. I'd like to speak with Mr. al-Rashid about yesterday's meeting. One moment, please. The wait felt eternal. In the background, I could hear muffled conversation in Arabic, then footsteps approaching the phone. Mrs. Richardson. Omar's voice was carefully neutral. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I imagine you weren't expecting a lot of things about yesterday's meeting, I said. I'd like to apologize for that, and to request a few minutes of your time. Privately. There was a pause. I was under the impression you were no longer involved with company operations. You were given a lot of incorrect impressions yesterday, I said. I'd like the opportunity to correct them. Another pause. Longer this time. Would you be available for lunch? There's a restaurant in the hotel. 1 o'clock? I'll be there. I hung up and immediately began second-guessing myself. What was I doing? I had no official authority at Richardson Industries anymore. Lionel and Juniper could legitimately claim I was interfering, overstepping boundaries I'd agreed to when I stepped down. But this wasn't about boundaries anymore. This was about watching everything Harold and I had built crumble under the management of people who didn't understand its value. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early, wearing the same navy suit but with different jewelry this time. The sapphire earrings Harold had brought me from Thailand after we'd completed a resort project there. They'd always made me feel powerful. Omar was already seated at a corner table, reading what looked like financial reports on a tablet. He stood when he saw me approaching, And I was struck again by how much he'd changed from the eager young man I'd known. This was someone who commanded rooms full of powerful people, who made decisions worth billions. "Mrs. Richardson," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for agreeing to see me," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, confident. "And please, call me Janine." We sat, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied his face, looking for traces of the young man who'd spent 3 months learning everything he could about international construction. He was looking at me, too, and I wondered what he saw. The woman who'd taught him to read geological surveys, or the elderly family member Juniper had dismissed. "You've done well for yourself," I said finally. "Harold always said you'd go far." Something shifted in his expression at the mention of Harold. I was sorry to hear about his passing. He was a good man and a brilliant engineer. I learned more in those 3 months with Richardson Industries than in 2 years of graduate coursework. He would have been pleased to hear that. I paused, gathering my courage. "I have to ask, is that why you came? Because of your connection to our company?" Omar smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. "Partly. I've been following Richardson Industries for years, watching your projects, your reputation. When I heard Harold had passed and the company was struggling, I thought perhaps what? Perhaps there might be an opportunity for mutual benefit. My company has extensive operations throughout the Gulf region. We're always looking for partners who understand the complexities of working in that environment." I felt a flutter of excitement. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Harold and I would have jumped at. "And after yesterday's meeting?" His smile faded. "After yesterday's meeting, I'm concerned that Richardson Industries may no longer be the company I thought it was." "What if I told you it could be again?" He studied me carefully. "I'd ask what authority you have to make such a claim." It was a fair question, and one I couldn't answer with corporate titles or official positions, but I could answer it with truth. "None," I said. "Officially, I have no authority at all. I'm a retired widow whose son and daughter-in-law barely tolerate my presence, but unofficially, I'm the person who built most of the relationships you're probably thinking about. I'm the one who learned Arabic so we could negotiate our own contracts. I'm the one who spent months in Jordan and Qatar and the UAE, building the reputation that brought you to our door." Omar leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Your daughter-in-law seemed to think that experience was outdated. My daughter-in-law has an MBA from Wharton and 3 years of experience with Richardson Industries," I said. "I have 25 years of hands-on experience in international construction and relationships that took decades to build. Which do you think is more relevant to what you're considering?" He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. "You make a compelling argument." The waiter approached to take our order, and I noticed Omar ordering in Arabic. When the waiter looked confused, Omar switched to English with an apologetic smile. "Sorry, Habit," he said. "I've been doing business in the region for so long. I sometimes forget not everyone speaks Arabic." "لا تعتذر. هذا طبيعي تماما," I replied. "Don't apologize. That's completely natural." The change in Omar's expression was instant and dramatic. His eyes widened, and he straightened in his chair as if I'd just revealed I could fly. "أنت تتحدثين العربية?" he asked. "You speak Arabic?" "نعم. تعلمتها عندما بدأنا العمل في الشرق الأوسط." I answered. "Yes, I learned it when we started working in the Middle East." For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he began speaking in rapid Arabic, testing my comprehension, asking about my experience in various countries, discussing technical aspects of construction projects we'd worked on. I answered fluently, falling back into the comfortable rhythm of a language I'd spent years mastering. Across the restaurant, I noticed other diners glancing our way, probably wondering why a woman in her 60s was having an animated conversation in Arabic with a distinguished Middle Eastern businessman. "Your pronunciation is excellent," Omar said, switching back to English. "Where did you study?" "I didn't. Formally. I learned from our project managers and local partners. Harold used to say I had an ear for languages, but honestly, it was necessity. You can't build real relationships if you can't communicate properly." Omar nodded slowly. Yesterday, when I asked about historical relationships and institutional knowledge, your daughter-in-law acted as if such things were irrelevant to modern business. Juniper sees the company as a collection of assets to be optimized, I said carefully. She doesn't understand that relationships are assets too, and some of the most valuable ones can't be quantified on a spreadsheet. Such as, I thought about how much to reveal, how much trust to extend. Then I decided to take the gamble. Prince Khalid sends his nephew to intern with an American construction company, I said. That nephew spends 3 months learning not just about construction, but about how to build partnerships based on mutual respect and shared expertise. Years later, that nephew has become one of the most successful businessmen in the Gulf region. When he looks for new partnerships, does he remember the company that saw him as cheap labor or the one that treated him as a future leader? Omar's smile was slow and warm. He remembers the woman who taught him to read soil composition reports and the man who trusted him to manage a crew of experienced workers. Exactly. That's the kind of institutional knowledge Juniper thinks is outdated. We ordered lunch, but I barely tasted my food. For the first time in 2 years, I was having the kind of conversation I'd thought I'd never have again. Complex, strategic, about real business with real impact. Tell me about the manufacturing division, Omar said. Your daughter-in-law seems eager to sell it. I explained the division's history, its role in our overall operations, the expertise of our workforce. Omar listened intently, occasionally asking technical questions that made it clear he understood the business far better than Juniper had realized. She's not wrong about the profit margins being lower, I admitted, but she doesn't understand the strategic value. Manufacturing gives us control over quality and timelines. It's what allowed us to complete those Gulf projects on schedule when other companies failed. And the 200 employees? Many of them have been with us for 15 to 20 years. They're not just workers. They're the reason our reputation for quality exists. Omar nodded thoughtfully. In my experience, companies that treat their employees as disposable usually end up being disposable themselves. As we talked, I felt something awakening in me that had been dormant since Harold's death. The excitement of complex problem-solving, the satisfaction of strategic thinking, the pure joy of working with someone who understood both the technical and human aspects of business. I have a proposal, Omar said as we finished lunch. But it would require your active involvement, not just consultation. My heart raced. What kind of proposal? A joint venture. My company has 3 major projects planned for the next 5 years: a hospital in Kuwait, a university complex in Oman, and a water treatment facility in Jordan. Richardson Industries has exactly the expertise we need, but I need partners I can trust, people who understand the culture and the complications. I need the Richardson Industries that built those facilities in Qatar and Jordan, not the one that's planning to sell its manufacturing division to fund luxury condos. I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. That's a decision Lionel and Juniper would have to make. Actually, Omar said, it's a decision you would have to make. I'm offering to work with Richardson Industries, but only if Janine Richardson is the project manager. Non-negotiable. The words hit me like a physical shock. I haven't managed a project in 2 years, but you remember how, don't you? I thought about those files in Harold's study, about the relationships I'd built, about the satisfaction of seeing a project through from conception to completion. Yes, I said, I remember. Then here's my offer, a 5-year partnership worth approximately $200 million. Your company handles the construction, mine handles the financing and local coordination. 50-50 split on profits. The numbers made my head spin. $200 million would not only save Richardson Industries, it would make it one of the most successful construction companies in the country. There's just one condition, Omar continued. I deal directly with you. No intermediaries, no delegation. If Janine Richardson isn't running these projects, the deal is off. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at either the best opportunity of my professional life or the destruction of what little relationship I had left with my son. I'll need to discuss this with Lionel, I said finally. Of course. But Janine? Omar's voice was serious now. Yesterday, your daughter-in-law told me that the previous generation was no longer relevant to Richardson Industries. Today, you've shown me that the previous generation might be the only thing that can save it. As we shook hands outside the restaurant, I realized that everything had changed. In 2 hours, I'd gone from being an invisible widow to being the linchpin of the biggest deal in my company's history. Now, I just had to figure out how to tell Lionel and Juniper that the woman they'd tried to silence was about to become their salvation. I called Lionel from the hotel lobby, my hands still trembling from the conversation with Omar. The magnitude of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. $200 million, a 5-year partnership, international projects that could restore Richardson Industries to its former glory, and it all hinged on me. Mom? Lionel's voice was strained when he answered. Where are you? Juniper's been looking for you. She heard you might have contacted that investor. I need you to come to the Fairmont downtown, I said. Both of you. We need to talk. About what? Mom, if you did something to mess up our chances with Al-Rashid, just come, I interrupted. Conference room B on the mezzanine level. 1 hour. I hung up before he could argue and spent the next 60 minutes pacing the small conference room I'd reserved, rehearsing what I was going to say. How do you explain to your son that his wife's arrogance nearly cost them everything? How do you tell him that the mother he'd sidelined was now the key to saving his company? They arrived together, Juniper's face a mask of barely controlled fury. She strode into the room like she was approaching a hostile takeover, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. What exactly do you think you're doing? She demanded before I could even speak. Do you have any idea how inappropriate it is for you to contact our potential investors behind our backs? Sit down, I said calmly, gesturing to the chairs across from me. Don't you dare tell me to sit down, Juniper snapped. You had no right. I said sit down. Something in my voice made them both freeze. It was a tone I hadn't used in 2 years, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in boardrooms and construction sites. They sat. I opened the folder I'd brought with me and slid a document across the table. This is a letter of intent from Al-Rashid International. They're offering Richardson Industries a 5-year partnership worth $200 million. Lionel's eyes widened as he scanned the document. Juniper leaned over to read it, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic. This can't be real, she said finally. He walked out of our meeting. He said he'd be in touch, which everyone knows is business speak for never calling again. He walked out because you insulted him, I said. You dismissed 25 years of international relationships as outdated. You called the knowledge he was seeking irrelevant. You treated him like he was some provincial businessman who didn't understand modern commerce. I was professional, Juniper protested. I presented our expansion plans, our profit projections. You presented a fantasy, I cut her off. Luxury residential development in a market you don't understand, with profit margins you pulled out of thin air. Meanwhile, you completely ignored the assets that brought him to our door in the first place. Lionel was still staring at the document. $200 million, he whispered. Hospital construction in Kuwait, I continued. A university complex in Oman, water treatment facilities in Jordan. These are exactly the kinds of projects your father and I built our reputation on. But how did you... Lionel looked up at me with confusion. How did you get him to make this offer? Because I speak his language, I said. Literally and figuratively. Juniper's laugh was sharp and bitter. What's that supposed to mean? Instead of answering in English, I spoke in Arabic. It means I understand that business in the Middle East is built on relationships, trust, and respect for experience. The silence that followed was deafening. Lionel's mouth fell open. Juniper's face went white, then red, then white again. You speak Arabic? Lionel asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Arabic? Mandarin, and enough Portuguese to negotiate contracts in Brazil, I said. I also have personal relationships with government ministers in 6 countries, engineering contacts throughout the Gulf region, and 25 years of experience managing international construction projects. I reached into my folder and pulled out more documents. Here are letters of recommendation from the Kuwait Ministry of Public Works. Here's a contract renewal offer from the Jordan Water Authority that's been sitting in your father's files for 2 years. Here's an invitation to bid on a hospital project in Dubai that you never even knew existed. I spread the papers across the table like playing cards. This is what Juniper calls outdated institutional knowledge. This is what Omar al-Rashid came looking for yesterday. Juniper finally found her voice. Even if that's true, even if you have these connections, you're retired. You handed the company over to Lionel. You don't get to just waltz back in and what? I asked. Save it from bankruptcy? We're not bankrupt, she protested. Not yet, I agreed. But you will be within 18 months if you follow your current plan. I've seen the real numbers, Juniper. The ones you think Lionel doesn't understand well enough to question. I pulled out another document, this one from my own investigation of the company's finances. Manufacturing division. Profitable, stable, employing 200 people. Overhead costs. Manageable. Growth potential. Modest, but steady. I slid the paper toward them. Your luxury development plan requires an initial investment of $50 million we don't have, in a market where we have no experience, no contacts, and no reputation. Projected completion time, 3 to 5 years. Assuming no complications. Probability of success, optimistic at best. Lionel was reading the financial analysis with growing alarm. These numbers... Juniper, you told me the manufacturing division was losing money. It's not profitable enough, she said quickly. The margins are too small, the growth potential is limited. The margins are steady, I corrected. The growth is sustainable, and the reputation it maintains is what brought Omar al-Rashid to our door. I leaned forward, looking directly at my son. Lionel, in the 3 years since you took over, how many new contracts has the company secured? He looked uncomfortable. Well, we've been focusing on strategic planning. How many? I pressed. 4, he admitted. Small ones. In the 5 years before your father got sick, we secured an average of 12 contracts per year, with a total value of over $30 million annually. Do you know why? He shook his head. Because we didn't just bid on projects. We built relationships. We understood that construction is a people business, especially international construction. You don't get contracts by sending in the lowest bid. You get them by proving you can be trusted to deliver on time, on budget, and to the highest standards. I turned to Juniper. That's what you don't understand. You see Richardson Industries as a collection of assets to be leveraged. But our real assets aren't equipment or property. They're relationships, reputation, and expertise. And you can't build any of those with an MBA and a PowerPoint presentation. Juniper's face was flushed with anger. You're living in the past. The business world has changed. Has it? I interrupted. Omar al-Rashid is one of the most successful businessmen in the Gulf region. His company is worth billions. Yesterday, he flew here specifically to meet with Richardson Industries. Not because of your expansion plans or your profit projections, but because he remembered a company that treated him with respect 15 years ago. I pulled out one more document, a photo of Omar, Harold, and me at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Qatar water treatment facility. Omar looked impossibly young in his hard hat and work clothes, but his smile was genuine as he stood between Harold and me. This is what brought him here, I said. The memory of working with people who saw potential in a 24-year-old engineering student and trusted him to help manage a crew of experienced workers. Lionel stared at the photo. I never knew any of this. I know, I said gently. I protected you from the complexities of the business because I wanted you to have a normal childhood. But maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I should have prepared you better for what you'd inherit. This doesn't change anything, Juniper said. But her voice lacked its usual conviction. You still have no official role in the company. You can't just... Actually, I can. I slid the final document across the table. Omar's offer comes with one non-negotiable condition. He'll only work with Richardson Industries if I personally manage the projects. Not consult on them. Not advise. Manage. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Lionel's breathing, which had become rapid and shallow. "What does that mean?" he asked finally. "It means you have a choice," I said. "You can accept Omar's partnership and bring me back as senior project manager, or you can decline it and continue with Juniper's luxury development plan." I gathered my papers and stood up, but understand this. If you choose the second option, Richardson Industries will be out of business within 2 years. The manufacturing division will be sold to pay debts. Your 200 employees will be unemployed. And the company your father and I spent 25 years building will be nothing but a memory. I moved toward the door, then paused. "The offer expires at midnight tomorrow. Omar flies back to Dubai at 10 a.m. and he won't be making another trip to negotiate." As I reached for the door handle, Lionel's voice stopped me. "Mom." His voice was small, uncertain. "I don't know how to do this. I never wanted to run the company. After Dad died, it seemed like what I was supposed to do." I turned back to face him, my son, 35 years old, successful by most measures, but drowning in responsibilities he'd never asked for and didn't understand. "I know," I said softly. "And if you want out, if you want to pursue art history or museum work or anything else, we can make that happen. But Richardson Industries doesn't have to die with your father. It can live and grow and employ people and build things that matter." I looked at Juniper, who was staring at the documents on the table with an expression I couldn't read. "But only if we stop pretending that inexperience is an asset and start valuing the knowledge that took decades to build." I left them sitting in that conference room with $200 million worth of opportunities spread across the table, and 24 hours to decide whether pride was worth more than survival. As I drove home, I realized I was no longer the invisible widow who'd been dismissed and humiliated. For the first time in 2 years, I was Janine Richardson, the woman who could speak to ministers and sheiks, who could read geological surveys and manage international teams, the woman who could save everything Harold and I had built. Now I just had to wait to see if my family would let me. The call came at 11:30 that night. I'd been sitting in Harold's study, surrounded by old project files and international contracts, trying to prepare for the possibility that Lionel would say yes. Part of me was terrified that he would. It had been 2 years since I'd managed anything more complex than my household budget. "Mom?" Lionel's voice was exhausted. "We accept." I closed my eyes, relief and terror warring in my chest. "All of it? Omar's conditions?" "All of it." "Juniper." It took some convincing, but she understands the numbers now. "We need this partnership." What he didn't say, but I could hear in his voice, was that it had been more than convincing. It had probably been the first real fight of their marriage, the first time Lionel had stood up to his wife's certainty. "There's one more thing," he continued. "I want to learn. Really learn. The way I should have years ago. Will you teach me?" This time the relief was pure, uncomplicated by fear. "Yes," I said. "I'll teach you everything I know." The next morning, I dressed for business in my best suit, charcoal gray with a silk blouse that Harold had always said brought out my eyes. I arrived at the office an hour early and walked through the building that had been my second home for 25 years. It felt different now. Not smaller or diminished, but full of potential again. I could see past the outdated carpets and faded paint to what Richardson Industries could become with proper leadership and international partnerships. Sarah looked up as I entered the main office, her face brightening with a smile I hadn't seen in months. "Mrs. Richardson, Mr. Lionel said you'd be coming in. Should I prepare your old office?" "Not yet," I said, "but maybe soon." Omar arrived at 10 sharp, accompanied by 2 assistants and a lawyer. He looked rested and confident, like a man who'd gotten exactly what he'd hoped for. When our eyes met across the conference room, he smiled with genuine warmth. "Janine," he said, extending his hand, "I'm pleased you decided to accept the partnership." "I'm pleased you offered it," I replied. Juniper was already seated at the table, her expression carefully neutral. She'd clearly spent considerable time on her appearance. Her hair was perfect, her makeup flawless, her suit expensive and professional, but there was something different about her posture, a subtle acknowledgement that the dynamics had shifted. Lionel looked nervous but determined. "Omar, thank you for your patience with our family's transition period." "Transition periods are necessary," Omar said diplomatically. "What matters is arriving at the right destination." For the next 2 hours, we discussed details, project timelines, financial arrangements, logistics coordination. It was complex work, the kind that required understanding of international law, local customs, engineering challenges, and political nuances. Juniper contributed when she could, but I could see her recognition that this conversation was beyond her expertise. She wasn't stupid. Her MBA from Wharton was genuine, her business knowledge real. But she was finally understanding the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. The Kuwait hospital project, Omar was saying, has some unique challenges. The site has underground water issues, and the local building codes are particular. Saltwater intrusion? I asked. We dealt with similar problems in Qatar. There are specialized foundation techniques that work well in that environment. Exactly. You remember the Al Jara Medical Center? Of course. We developed a custom drainage system that prevented long-term structural damage. The engineering reports are in our archives. Omar nodded with satisfaction. That's exactly the kind of institutional knowledge I was hoping to access. I glanced at Juniper, whose face showed a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. She was beginning to understand what she'd almost thrown away. By noon, we'd outlined the basic framework of our partnership. Richardson Industries would handle construction and project management. Al Rashid International would provide financing and local coordination. I would serve as senior project manager, with Lionel as my deputy and eventual successor. There's one more thing, Omar said as we prepared to sign the preliminary agreements. I'd like to discuss the manufacturing division. Juniper tensed. We're still considering our options regarding. I'd like to purchase a 20% stake, Omar continued. Keep it as part of Richardson Industries, but expand its capabilities to support our Middle Eastern projects. The silence that followed was profound. Juniper's mouth fell open. Lionel blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what he'd heard. You want to invest in manufacturing? Lionel asked. Quality control is essential for international projects, Omar explained. Having our own manufacturing capability means we control timelines and standards. It's not just an asset, it's a competitive advantage. I felt a surge of vindication so strong it was almost dizzying. This was exactly what Harold and I had understood 20 years ago when we'd built the manufacturing division. It wasn't just about profit margins. It was about reliability, quality, and control. The 20% stake would be worth approximately $15 million, Omar continued, which should provide more than enough capital for modernization and expansion. $15 million. Enough to update equipment, expand capacity, and secure the jobs of every employee in the division. The division Juniper had wanted to sell for scrap. That's very generous, Lionel managed. It's good business, Omar corrected. I'm not being generous. I'm securing the supply chain for projects worth $200 million. As we signed the documents, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Purpose, not just the satisfaction of work, but the deep fulfillment that comes from building something meaningful. 3 months later, I stood in the departure lounge at the airport, reviewing final preparations for the Kuwait trip. The hospital project was moving ahead of schedule, thanks to relationships I'd maintained and expertise I'd thought I'd never use again. Nervous? Lionel asked, settling into the seat beside me. Over the past 3 months, he'd thrown himself into learning the international construction business with the enthusiasm of someone finally doing work that mattered to him. Excited, I corrected. It's been a long time since I've managed a project of this scope. You're sure you don't mind me tagging along? I smiled at him. I'm counting on it. Someone needs to learn how to maintain these relationships when I really do retire. Across the departure lounge, Omar finished a phone call and walked toward us. Over the past months, our professional relationship had developed into something deeper. He was brilliant, accomplished, and kind in ways that had nothing to do with business. He was also lonely in the way that successful people often are, dedicated to his work, but isolated by his position. The Minister of Health is looking forward to meeting you again, he said, settling into the seat on my other side. He remembered you from the Al Jara project. Sheikh Rahman has an excellent memory, I said, and an even better sense of humor. You'll have to tell me those stories sometime, Lionel said. I'm still learning about all the projects you and Dad worked on. We have a long flight, Omar said with a smile. Perfect time for stories. As we boarded the plane, I reflected on how much had changed in just 6 months. Richardson Industries was not only stable, but growing. Lionel was developing into the kind of leader I'd always hoped he could be. Even Juniper had found her place, focusing on domestic operations where her skills were perfectly suited, and I had found something I'd thought was lost forever. Not just purpose, but partnership. Omar and I understood each other in ways that went beyond business. We shared the satisfaction of complex problems solved, of relationships built across cultural divides, of creating things that would outlast us. "You know," Omar said quietly as the plane taxied down the runway, "I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For taking a chance on a 24-year-old kid who thought he knew everything about engineering." I laughed. "You did know everything about engineering. You just needed to learn about people. And you taught me that business is always about people, even when it looks like it's about concrete and steel." The plane lifted off, carrying us toward projects that would employ hundreds of people, provide essential services to thousands more, and continue the legacy Harold and I had started 25 years ago. 6 months ago, I'd been a humiliated widow, dismissed as irrelevant by my own family. Today, I was flying to Kuwait as senior project manager for one of the most significant construction projects in the region, accompanied by my son who was finally learning to be the leader he was meant to be, and by a man who saw me not as an elderly family member, but as an accomplished professional, and, increasingly, as something more. At 66, I was discovering that some stories don't end with retirement. Some stories find their most important chapters in what looks like the final act. "Tell me about the water treatment facility," Lionel said, pulling out his notebook. "The one where you first met Omar." I glanced at Omar, who was smiling with the same warmth I remembered from that earnest young man in the Qatar desert. "It's a long story," I said. "We have time," he replied, and in his voice I heard not just reference to the flight ahead, but to the years we were building together. As we flew toward Kuwait, toward projects that would challenge and fulfill us, toward a future neither of us had imagined 6 months ago, I began to tell the story of how a construction project had become the foundation for everything that followed. Some humiliations, I realized, are just beginnings in disguise, and some languages, whether Arabic or the universal language of respect and competence, are worth learning at any age, because you never know when they might change your life. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.